Hey everyone, and welcome back to the Commander Clash podcast. This week is going to be a special one. As you can see, I have taken hold of the host role for the first time in a long time. I'm back in the seat because this podcast is not a regular podcast, but it's actually an intervention for one person in particular, Richard. Richard, you got bamboozled. You thought it was a regular podcast. But no, this is actually an intervention because we're going to be talking about mana rocks in Commander. We've had some hot takes recently over on Commander Clash on the podcast, but also in our gameplay, where some of us, I'm not going to name names, but some of us have been very, very anti mana rocks in general in Commander, to the point where I believe, Richard, you don't run them ever. You will never run them. Is that true?
Stars, asterisks, but yes, in general, the stance is true. But I do run like Darksteel Ingot, Skyclave Relic. You know, I will play the utility ones like Cursed Mirror, Great Henge, but you will never catch me with Arcane. If you see Richard play Arcane Signet, it's an alien clone. Get rid of him.
Okay.
Actually, I just literally played it last week or whatever, and I everything that I was worried about came to fruition. I will never normally play Arcane Signet. And I don't know why you singling me out. First of all, I don't have a problem. I don't know who this intervention is for. Saffron Olive is my buddy here. Seth will not play Arcane Signet.
I'm on Richard's side. Not quite as extreme as Richard, I don't think. I'm not like the never play a mana rock ever under any circumstances, but I do my best to avoid them. Sometimes one or two slip in. I'm the same with the utility stuff. Like, if it's serving another purpose, I don't really think of it like a mana rock. If it's drawing me a million cards or cloning creatures, that's like making mana as the upside. I'm playing it for another reason. I get a bonus that sometimes it makes mana. But yeah, not quite as strict as Richard, but pretty close. So I'm definitely on his side of this intervention, I guess.
Well,
help me, Tomer. Help me, Morgan.
Well, the whole thing is that,
I don't have a problem. You guys are. I don't know what I'm here for.
I'm still team Arcane Signet on a bunch of decks. I think I counted. It was over a third of my deck still run Arcane Signet, and I'll get to the reasons why. But I was noticing that both Seth and Richard were very much anti-mana rocks. Well, Richard more than Seth, but Seth is leaning on that way. So I need to have some help on my side for Team Pro Mana Rocks. So I've enlisted our trusty editor, Morgan, returns to the podcast to help me keep up Arcane Signet's good name. So Morgan, how do you feel about Mana Rocks in general?
Happy to come to your aid. It's been a while. Happy to be back. But yeah, Mana Rocks, they still go in not all of my decks, but basically all of my decks. There's obviously the utility ones, which we've already talked about, but mana is mana, and you just gotta know how to use it, when to use it, and that's a big chunk of what we're going to talk about today.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of plenty of nuanced debate to talk about the pros and cons of Mana Rocks and which Commander decks are best suited for them and which ones you should be keeping an eye on, maybe some that might be overrated. But before we get into all of that discussion, we have to have a quick shout out to our sponsors. So today's show is brought to you by Ultimate Guard, premium protection for your trading cards. All the gaming accessories we use on this channel are supplied by Ultimate Guard, so you can flick your cards silky smooth like saffron olive. Check out ultimateguard.com. And then today's show is also brought to you by Card Conduit, the easiest way to sell your Magic cards. Card Conduit lets you skip all the typing, time, and work associated with buy listing. Their curated service lets you send in as many cards as you want with buy list value $1 or more, and you'll pay just a 5% service fee. You can also use their sorted service where you list and sort your cards and pay only 2%. You'll get a detailed report and fast payment once your order is processed. You can get another 10% off by heading over to cardconduit.com/mtggoldfish. We also have the Ultimate Guard comment of the week. So last week, we were doing a trivia game show where Krim, spoiler, did very well, kind of mopped the rest of us up a little bit. And we have the top comment was from @JohnLemmings9593. There really needed to be a moderator. The amount of repeats and non-repeat callouts was hilarious. I think that's definitely true, right?
That is fine. It's part of the fun. I'm surprised you didn't catch the repeats. That means you forgot what you stated, right?
I think I messed over Phil one time, actually, because I said like Talisman of Creativity and no, Curiosity. And then he said creativity. And I'm like, no, I already said creativity. Like, oh no. I'm sorry.
Did you not say anything because you were afraid someone already said it? I know when we were doing like talisman and stuff, I was like, I don't know if someone said this one or not, so I'm just gonna pretend like they said it and avoid the whole issue.
Yeah, at some point there was like so many talismans being said. I'm like, I don't know. Like, I'm not writing them down to see which one is which. But
like me, don't know any of them, so it doesn't matter.
Yeah, exactly.
We also have a bonus comment that Richard pointed out from Lazy Dino 59. Richard caught in 4K disliking the comment of the week. That was funny.
That is
funny.
Guys.
That was the best part.
Pretty good.
When I read that comment, I'm like, oh no, did I like fat finger downvote something when I was like getting the thing? But then I realized I didn't do it. Our editor set us up. Not Morgan. We have another editor, Austin, who's doing it. And apparently he downvoted it. Because if I did it, you would see like MTG Goldfish Commander downvoted this comment, right? You would see it there, right? And I'm like, Seth, did I accidentally do it? We got to go in and fix it. This looks so sus, right? And then I went in, I'm like, wait a minute, it's not downvoted. I'm like, oh no,
yeah,
I've been set up.
Throwing another person under the bus, Richard.
I've been had.
The Godfather is ruthless.
Ruthless. I'm just gonna cut it out of the podcast. Funny. You know, there's so many unknown comment of the weeks. You guys just trust me to choose the top one. You don't know what happens. You don't know what happens.
They're actually all Richard. Richard
I have a bot farm.
Putting in he's putting in the top comments every single week, and
that's why it's always about him.
Yeah, it's always the rage bait ones. Yeah. All right, let's get to discussion at hand. We're talking about mana rocks. Before we start talking about the nuances, pros and cons for mana rocks, we talked a lot about this in the intro, but I wanted to just go around the table and I wanted to hear everybody's just like idea of mana rocks. Like in general, what do you think of them? Where are you running them in your commander decks currently? Like what type of decks and how are you feeling about right now? And then we'll get into the nitty and gritty about it afterwards. So Richard, this is an intervention. So I want you to kick it off. You hate mana rocks to the point that you're just running extra turn spells in blue decks and calling it an explorer.
Yeah. So this is not. I don't have some agenda against mana rocks. And people think like, oh, I don't know why he woke up one day and decided to declare war on Arcane Signet. Yeah. After 17 seasons of Clash, or I think 17, right? At 25 episodes a clip, this is our conclusion, right? And the conclusion is, I play a mana rock. So I used to play Arcane Signet. You can go back in time. There is some point where I just stopped playing them, but before then I played lots, right? You play stuff, and at some point the board gets wrathed, or like maybe a Bane of Progress goes off or something, and then you're down a significant amount of mana now, right? Like you may have used like 2-3 mana rocks. We've seen the Phil classic of Soul Ring into Arcane Signet, into Commander, into Hour of Revelation, and like he is absolutely cooked at that point. So I would rather pay 1, 2, or 3 additional mana to play terrible options that guarantee in the late game I have my mana advantage still, that no one can take away my mana advantage as we go late game. And that's why I still play Skyclave Relic and Darksteel Ingot sometimes. Like they die to Farewell and maybe like a sacrifice effect. I can't think of a sacrifice effect, but they're effectively they're indestructible, so they're very hard to deal with. But even then, I like shy away. I only play them when I have artifact synergies. I still I don't go all in on them. I just do not like mana rocks, and I have seen so many games where people just auto lose on the spot, right? Like we talk about the crazy win percentages at MagicCon. Like how do you walk away from a weekend at MagicCon at 90% win rate? Absurd, right? It's very easy, right? Because when your 3 mana spell wipes the whole board and takes half people's manas with them, they're out of the game, right? Like they simply cannot win anymore. Yep. And if they muster anything back, a second wipe will do them in for good. And that's how you just win an absurd number of games, right? Like you're like, I just cast one spell and like it was like an Armageddon plus Wrath of God for you, right? So you cannot convince me to play a mana rock like ever. Like I'm super curious what you guys have to say, but understand this is like my highest conviction thing. Like I will play Swords to Plowshares a million times over before I play this. I will play all basics a million times over before I play mana rocks, because basic lands are indestructible, right? Like a Swords to Plowshares is one card, but having 10 cards in my deck go bye-bye in the mid game to late game is like not cool for me. So I'm curious what you guys think, or like, what the strategy is for using mana rocks to make sure you don't end up like in the hole.
Like, so I just wanted to clarify. So you're basically, your outlook on mana in Commander is essentially you want to play for a late game and you want to be resilient to board wipes. Like, you want to make sure that your mana doesn't get destroyed, and you want to go for a late game. Like, you don't mind playing more expensive or slower mana ramp package in order to make sure that it's just more concrete, resilient against removal.
Yes. I don't want to get weaker after every board wipe. I want to get stronger.
Okay.
And I don't want to waste all my early turns, right? Like if you just play stuff, like even if they just cycle and draw cards, you wasted all that mana, right? Like you could have done something else. I would never play Arcane Signet in green. I know I saw a Reddit post where people were like, I've started dropping Arcane Signet in green. I'm like, what? I'm like, why were you even playing? I don't understand, right? But yeah.
I mean, I've seen a Reddit post that said, like, I'm running more lanes now. I'm at 36. I'm like, well, we're getting there. Like,
we're getting there.
We're doing it.
We're getting there slowly. All right. Seth, what's your current philosophy on mana rocks in Commander? When do you run them, and where do you don't run them, and why?
It's not that different from Richard, honestly. Like, so I think mana rocks suck, but sometimes they're a necessary evil in some decks where I play a few of them. So my philosophy is basically, I will never play a mana rock in a green deck or a white deck. I will try to avoid them as much as possible in black and blue and red decks, because you can fill in with a lot of other forms of ramp. Sometimes I end up a little short, and I like throw in a couple of utility rocks to kind of like fill the gaps of my ramp, especially if I can get more value out of them in another way. But I think it basically comes down to what Richard said, where I think this is a relatively recent invention, where I think the move away from mana rocks is just a response to the current card pool and what Wizards is printing. Like, in the last few years, Wizards has really aggressively started printing these like blow up or exile the whole board wraths. Like, that's like their new thing, where every other set there's like an Ondu inversion, an Hour of Revelation, a Farewell. There's so many cards that just take out everything. So the days of early Commander, when I would play 15 mana rocks in every deck and be fine with it, they're just gone now, because everyone's playing these cards. Like, especially in the Clash meta, those are the true staples. Every white deck is playing like 4 or 5 or 6 of these exile everything, destroy everything wraths. And I think they're just straight up, mana rocks are straight up unplayable in that context. Like, we move away from it. I moved away from it because there's too many cards that hate on them. So why would I play cards that get blown up when I have that option to do the same thing with a card that isn't going to get blown up by Crim 10 times a game?
Is that really our Clash meta, though? Like, I know Farewell is a relatively new card, but Ondu Inversion is like many years ago. I'm thinking like Bane of Progress, Our Revelation is also many years ago.
I mean, by many,
we've seen a couple this season.
Yeah. A couple per season, but I don't think it's like
wait, okay. Rich,
that bad.
You play a lot of white. If you play white, do you have those cards in every single one of your white decks?
Yes.
I know.
If I play white, you play mana rocks, you'll auto lose. Like, I'm not even joking. So
are you actually running Farewell?
If I play Grixis, then you're safe, because I only have 2. I only have Oblivion Stone and Boom Piles, so the odds of me drawing it are a lot lower. But if I'm playing a tutor color and white, you better have a Clever Concealment, right? You better have a counterspell, or like everything is gonna go. And it's like, not even that hard, because Hour of Revelation you can cast like super early, right? You can do it on turn 4 or 5, like quite reasonably. And if I take 2 rocks in your commander, you're probably dead. Especially if I ramped in the process, right? So I think if someone is playing white, you're like totally like dead. And if no one is doing it, you play white yourself and just farm free wins off everyone, right? Like that's the problem. But if no one is playing white, you can get away with it.
I need to see the stats, because I don't think I don't think any of us play Farewell as much as we say we bring it up.
I never play Farewell, by the way.
I know.
So like, I don't play it in white.
I'll get to my opinion a little bit further, but I just wanted to clarify the question about like Farewell and all the time and board wipes all the time. We'll have to see. We'll have a Clash Stats episode soon enough, and we'll see how often they're actually being played. But Morgan, you're pro Arcane Signet, right? You gotta help me out here.
Yeah. So obviously Richard and Seth are a little bit on the utility rocks are cool, and they are. If you have some kind of archetype, I'm sure you can find some kind of mana rock that's like, yeah, it's 3 mana, but like, oh, look at this cool flashy thing it does, and it gives me a lot of value. Even if you only get like 1 use out of it, it might be worth it. So those are always worth keeping in mind. And then obviously the best mana rocks are the ones that will accelerate you, and that's like a timing thing, right? Like if, yes, mana rocks are fragile, they get destroyed in a lot of situations. Yes, if you're playing against white, you have to worry about your farewells and Hour of Revelations and all those cards, Austere Command. But even against green, you have to worry about Bane of Progress. So you do have to worry about these kind of things. But if you can time it out to where you're either going to, that turn or the next turn, get some kind of permanent value out of them, they're worth it, because at that point they are just an accelerant. So the best examples of this are fast mana. So this would be the Soul Rings and the Mana Vaults and things that you only have to use it once and it already got you ahead. But also, if you turn to a rock into your 4 mana card draw engine or 4 mana commander or something snowbally, comes down and is immediately giving you value a turn earlier, that also I think is usually worth it, especially if it's something that's going to, if it's Trouble in Pairs or something, something that's going to draw absurd amounts of cards, or your commander something like Prosper that's just going to snowball out of control. Maybe you follow it up into a real land ramp. I don't necessarily think that a bunch of mana rocks go in all decks. If you're playing green, you're playing white, you probably don't need many, if any. But I think they're still good. And I think the other point of them is that I actually really like them just in general in budget decks, because even like the 2 mana ones that don't do anything other than make mana, they're fixing. And I think that's worth keeping in mind if you're building on budget decks. Like if your deck is like, look at all these basic lanes and I have almost no duels, then it's like, well, I would like to have some fixing. So then there's extra utility and extra use out of your mana rocks. They're, yes, ramp, and yes, if they get to stick around and you get to use them more than a couple times, that's just like worth it in the long term, especially if you're turning it into long-term value. But then also it's helping you make sure you're casting things on curve just because you have the right pips and stuff.
Yeah, I think budget is definitely a concern. Like, I forget the Frank Karsten stats on it, but like if you want to play like a 3 mana commander, 3 color, 3 mana commander on curve, you're going to need like 23 sources of each of those colors. And that's going to be very difficult to do it without like a super janky tap land mana base. If you could use an Arcane Signet to actually just make sure you're casting your stuff that is a little bit more pip heavy or whatever.
Is this for budget decks, or you're talking about in general?
For budget decks.
Because I feel like if you, okay. Because for non-budget, you should be able to make a mana base where you're not worrying about that at all.
You run all the fetches, you run the triumphs, you run the shocks, you're good. It's like whatever. But if you don't have access to those things, and not every like if you go to like a random game store or something, I don't think everybody's bringing like $400 mana bases or whatever. So that can actually be a concern. Sometimes you just want to use the mana rocks for fixing. But yeah, personally, I'm kind of it's weird because I'm not like super heavy on mana rocks myself either. I was looking actually at my decks. I have like 15 decks, and I counted 6 decks that have mana rocks. And of those decks, the lowest I run is 2, which is currently my Zedger deck. And then the highest is 9, which is my Perforos deck. And my Perforos deck
Why do you run so many in Perforos?
It's mono red sneak attack dragons.
And the sneak attack Perforos. That makes more sense.
Yeah, and Perforos is expensive, and his activated ability is expensive, and I have very limited ways of actually ramping. And I noticed that the deck works best if I'm trying to ramp forward rather than like play catch up. Because then if, like the longer the game goes and then I establish Perforos, the worse it is because my opponents are ready for it and then they just, kill me. So I want the ramp there. So like when I'm thinking for mana rocks, I always think like I they're not always my first choice, but they're like kind of like a necessary evil to me. Like I want, they're fulfilling a specific role. In terms of like, I want to, like Morgan said, go from turn 2 and drop a turn 4 commander. And I think like, I hate to bring up the T word again, but it's really tempo to me. Is like sometimes when you're ramping out a thing that gives you a huge value, it's worth it to get it out earlier, get that value, and then if the board gets wiped later on, then fine, I already got the value out of it. Like Morgan said with the mana rocks, But also, it could also set you up in a situation where you've established a board state and you could hold up your protection spells. Like we talk about Farewell all the time, and Farewell is a big hitter. And same as like Cyclonic Rift, you have to be in basically white to protect yourself from that. But like an Hour of Revelation, for example, a lot of decks have answers to an Hour of Revelation. Like green has heroic intervention effects, white has lots of indestructibility and stuff, black has mass reanimation stuff. So once you actually have like, you know, establish a board state and you've drawn a bunch of cards or whatever, I think like having your mana rocks die afterwards is actually fine as long as you get the value out of it. And I think that's a tempo thing.
Okay, but I think there's a problem with this logic. And I think the problem I see with this logic is, let's say you do that and you're like, okay, my mana rocks are temporary. I'm going to speed out my commander. I'm going to get all this value. And then someone farewells their Hour of Revelations. Don't you lose all that value and all your mana rocks? Like, your commander is going to die. All the tokens it's making are going to die. Even if you got cards in hand, are you going to have mana to deploy all the cards that you drew off of them when you lose half your mana base? Probably not. So I don't know if I buy that logic, at least all that much. Because if somehow you're ramping into some sort of resilient value that isn't going to be disrupted by the inevitable sweeper, then I could see that argument. But if you're just ramping into your commander, then you're just paying the command tax to cast your commander and losing half your mana base when the Farewell happens or the Hour Revelation happens. Like it seems like that's actually a net negative for you, right? You're gonna have to recast it for more mana that you don't have anymore.
Well, so I think the permanence is the main thing in like, even if that happens, God forbid. Like, and also sometimes you're just gonna have a game where no one has the sweeper. Like that doesn't happen that often, but there are just gonna be games where someone's like, oh, we need a board wipe, and then no one finds it. So that's something you can keep in mind. Like every single thing in this game has some amount of risk tied to it, but that doesn't mean you don't put cards in your deck. Like that just is mind.
There's no risk to a basic land.
There is very little risk to land.
Armageddon,
the social norms of the
Armageddon.
You can't play it. You literally Armageddon. You can't play it. Oh my god.
I was on
but the number of people that play Armageddon is significantly less than the number of people that play Farewell and Ondu Inversion.
Yeah.
Like,
but even in the case that Seth brought up, where someone like casts the big board wipe, you lose your mana rocks, you lose your commander, even after you just ramped into it. If you have a fistful of cards, you're probably okay. A lot of decks have some amount of recursion. Like even if you're just like a generic white deck and you're not like a graveyard focused deck, you might just have a Sun Titan or something similar. So a lot of these decks just have built-in graveyard synergies. Obviously, that doesn't work with Farewell, but if you have a full hand. Like you drew some cards along the way because of that extra mana you had earlier in the game, you're probably okay because either the commander tax won't matter to you, or you already got your value, or you just have new cards, new threats to deploy, new ramp to cast. So it just translates to you're going to be fine. You're probably going to be able to rebuild a little bit better than the other person. And again, that doesn't necessarily mean you always run out your ramp on turn 2, but that's something to keep in mind. It's all about being able to build back.
Examples of translating the temporary advantage into a permanent one. So I like this theory, and I actually tried it in our Decades battle. So in the Decades battle, I was actually quite hamstrung for ramp because I was playing, 2010s, and I did not have like rampant growth. So my theory was I'm going to play Arcane Signet, I'm going to play Mana Dorks, and I'm going to play Explosive Vegetation afterwards to transform that temporary advantage into a permanent one, right? Now, normally you wouldn't do this because you can just play rampant growth, right? Like the colors that can ramp lands, they can just ramp lands from like an earlier mana curve, right? They don't need to play Mana Rock into ramping lands. In actuality, what happened was I didn't draw my ramp. I just got Wrath, lost like half my cards, and then that was that, right? Like I didn't get the perfect sequence to pull it off, right? Same with the Mana Dork argument. You're like, well, if I'm running Guardian Project or something, or if I'm running the Great Henge, my Mana Dorks can draw cards, right? So therefore, synergy, right? Like, therefore, I should play them. I played Elf Ball, played a bunch of Mana Dorks, didn't get the payoff, got Wrath, and the game was over, right? So sometimes your deck doesn't come together. But like, what are reliable ways of transforming that? Because like, we don't play like the Canopy lands, right? The Canopy lands are a land that you can just sack to draw a card, right? And we typically don't go down a mana to go up a card, right? So even if after I do all my stuff and the Hour of Revelation goes off, I have 7 cards in hand, but like half the mana of anyone, I feel that's like not a state I want to be in, right? I want to somehow translate that into something permanent. And that's usually lands. And the colors that can do that can ramp to begin with, right? I can't get lands in Grixis in any way, really. So like, what are some good commanders or decks that you guys find for this?
I have two options for this, because first you mentioned Mana Dorks, so I want to get the Mana Dorks out of the way. I feel like you kind of like Mana Dorks and Mana Rocks suffer the same issue, right? They both died to sweepers, so I assume, Richard, you don't run Mana Dorks either,
do you guys believe in mana? So here's the interesting part. The greater EDH community does not believe in Mana Dorks, right? Well, like you will find a far higher number of people that will not play Mana Dorks because they die to Wrath of God, right? But everyone plays Mana Rocks. But like Seth said, in this day and age, everything kills enchantments and artifacts and sweeps everything. So why are they not the same as Mana Dorks? So Mana Dorks even more efficient.
Because
one mana, mana rock, right?
Mana Rocks, I would argue, in a situation of sweepers, I would argue that Mana Rocks are safer than Mana Dorks. Because in sweepers, green has some options for mass gain rid of artifacts, and white has a bunch.
Yeah.
But then, like, you get to the Grixis colors, and you're really, there aren't as many options. There are
Rakdos,
some.
You're pretty safe,
but then you can just
Rakdos.
redeploy.
Well, actually, no. Red can kill them all, too.
No, red can kill,
but basically
black.
You're safe against black.
But then, like, basically all the colors have options for creatures. So I think that's part of it, is that even, like, black and red, they don't have the best artifact answers necessarily. I guess red has some artifact removal, but it doesn't have, outside of like Vandal Blast, it doesn't have a ton of like mass artifact removal in the same way that we associate with green and white. So in the Rakdos situation, they still have creature board wipes. They still have the Blasphemous Axe and the Dam and Damnation and all those. So I would argue that in those situations, the Mana Dorks are more fragile than the Mana Rocks in a large sense of
so you guys are down on
likely
mana
to run up against.
Dorks. No Dorks.
I'm not.
I would run some number of them in a creature specific deck. If I am a creature deck where I actually just built a deck like this, where I have 44 creatures in the deck, I have some Mana Dorks in the deck just because I want to trigger my Beast Whisperer and my Guardian Projects and all those things, like things that care about creatures. So
it's called Wood Elves.
But even that I wouldn't. Even that I wouldn't do it very
Wood
often.
Elves.
Oh yeah, that is a safe way of ramping with creatures. But I'm on team Mana Dorks, because like, so my deck building philosophy is like, I always aim at, I'm very synergy focused. I try to aim on synergy and capitalize on that, because I think synergy cards, synergy payoffs are going to be stronger than generic options usually, unless it's like, you know, up to the level of Smothering Tithe or something like that. Sometimes a staple is so powerful that even synergy pieces can't really attain to it. So on the case of Mana Dorks, I will run it in certain decks. One good option that is going to be similar to the Mana Rocks is Chulane, Teller of Tales. Whenever you cast a creature spell, you draw a card, then you may put a lane card from your hand onto the battlefield. I think this is an excellent example of where a Mana Dork is actually worth it for me, because my goal with a Chulane deck, all my ramp is going to be creature based. It's going to be Wood Elves, but it's also going to be like Laner Wolves and stuff like that too, because I want to start ramping as early as turn 1. I want to get Chulane ideally out on like turn 3, turn 4 latest, but that's like pretty bad. But like turn 3 Chulane is what I'm aiming for, because that means afterwards, once Chulane is on the battlefield, it's such an insane mana advantage engine and card advantage engine rolled into one, that all subsequent Laner Wolves and whatever, if Chulane's already on the battlefield and I've drawn more of them, I play an Elvish Mystic or whatever, it's drawn me a card and it potentially even ramped me too.
I mean, and then that makes a lot of sense, but how many Chulanes are there? So that is specifically rewards you for playing creatures, and it translates that into card draw and like land ramp, right?
You're right.
But how many cards like that actually exist though, right? They're so rare, right?
So you say Elf Ball, and I say Elf Bar. Yes, Elf Bar does get blown up by board wipes, right? And it's very hit or miss. It's very dicey.
Yeah.
Either the Elf Ball does its thing or the Elf Ball doesn't do a thing. But I played against enough Elf Ball decks that are tuned that anything outside of like a farewell, anything outside of that, if you're just doing like an Hour of Revelation, don't care, because the deck is running basically every single way of mass protecting the board. Every type of heroic intervention effect. If you're like the new Dionys deck, you have heroic, you have Inspiring Call. You have Rapid Vigor even. You have like a bunch of different ways of actually protecting your board. And if you're in Lathril, then you have also like Living End, and you have like any Patriarch's Bidding. All these ways, multiple ways
Guys
actually
are on
just
the tempo plan.
because like
here's what happens in reality, right? You do your elf ball, and I go up. I'm like, Hour Revelation. You're like, Heroic Intervention. Then Seth untaps. He's like, Ondu Inversion. Bye, Tomer. Next, right? Like it's like in reality, a lot of people are jostling for your board. Like, even if it's not a full sweeper, someone might just be firing like spot removal at your board. But right? Like, so the faster you accelerate out with the scary board, like every turn your arch enemy, you're just hemorrhaging cards out of your hand, right? Because everyone is trying to interact with you at this point, and then you're just like losing all these cards. So it's like really hard unless it's literally T-Pro and Clever Concealment. Those are the special ones because that one spell saves you for the entire turn cycle, right? Or like an extra turn spell, right? If you have a Time Warp, you can just take your extra turn and be done with it. But if you don't have those, it's so hard to keep that board alive, right?
But if you're multiple turns ahead of the rest of the table because you've been spending the first turns dropping dorks or whatever, and your other opponents are just doing lands and pass, and they're waiting for, I don't know, some 3-drop ramp spell or something like that. And I'm literally 2 turns ahead of everybody. I drop down like a Toski or something. I refill my hand. I think like you basically need to hope that the combined forces of multiple board wipes can take me down.
No, like one swords gets fired off at Toski, and it's like cool, right? Like now you're stuck getting the water.
Swords.
Nobody runs
because we don't need it.
It's not happening.
We don't need it, right? Like this hypothetical situation doesn't actually play out, right? Like if I felt like I needed the swords, I would play the swords, right? But I'm like, no, you're not fast enough to kill us, right? So then we just ramp 2, right?
So another situation where Mana Rocks and Mana Dorks are similar and worth it is how long something you have to factor in is how long they get to stick around, right?
Yes.
If you drop a Mana Rock or a Mana Dork turn 1, turn 2, and it's going to be a few turns before we even have to worry about the sweeper. If it is, so this is also just keeping in mind the Mana Dorks, Mana Rocks that do nothing except make mana. There are a lot that enter the battlefield, do a thing. Like there's like that one elf that like enters the battlefield. It's a Mana Dork, but also draws you a card. Like there's things like that, or in the Mana Rock department, obviously there's tons of awesome utility ones. So just keeping in mind the ones that do nothing except make mana. If it makes more mana than you spent on it, isn't that worth it? You would play an Ancient Tomb that doesn't hurt you, right? And it's usually going to be colored mana, which is even better, right?
Because do you play rituals? So rituals are like when I see Mana Dorks or Mana Rocks, I think rituals, right? Because a ritual is a card where you pay like 1 mana and you get like 2 or 3 mana back, right? And your job is to translate that into a win, right? Like, because usually you can't get like a temporary advantage out of it. You got to just kind of win. And so usually only Storm decks play this. But one card, you net like 2-3 mana. Like if you play an Arcane Signet on turn 2, right? And then turn 3, turn 4, you gain 2 mana, but you're actually just neutral because you spent 2 mana for the Arcane Signet. Turn 3, you're up 1 mana. And then a Wrath goes. And then you just literally just casted like a Dark Ritual or something, right? So do you play Dark Ritual normally? Phil plays Dark Ritual, by the way, unironically. I've seen him play it multiple times just as.
But Mana Rocks and Mana Dorks are easier to get back than your Dark Rituals, right? And then we also see that Mana Geyser's busted, right? Like we've seen that a few times on Clash.
If your Mana Rock is 2 mana and made like 5 mana, we could be talking.
If there was a Mana Rock that tapped for 30 and cost 2,
it's called Soul Ring, by the way, right? Soul Ring like kind of gets passed because it does something crazy, right?
I also think it's like unfair to assume that like every single Mana Dork you play and every single Mana Rock you play immediately dies like the next turn to this hypothetical board wipe. I think if that was true, first of all, we would see Farewells playing in Commander Clash, but we rarely do. Swords of Plowshares we never see on Commanders. I don't remember the last time I've ever seen a sword.
Phil sometimes plays it.
Phil, but Phil played it one time. Then the other thing.
This is an interesting question. So in a meta that no one punishes Mana Rocks are safe. Is that what we're saying? Like it's good because you're not going to get punished by it, right?
I'm just saying in a realistic situation where like Mana Rocks, we're coming at this with the argument like the Mana Rocks have an expected life expectancy of 1 turn on average, and I think that's not a fair assumption.
I think you're looking at it backwards, though. It's not that the Mana Rocks or Mana Dorks life expectancy is too short. It's that the life expectancy for ramping a land is literally +1 mana for the rest of the game. So it doesn't really matter. Like, if it's an opportunity cost, I get 100 slots in my deck. I get so many that can play ramp spells. If my choice is play a mana dork that's going to live for some amount of time versus ramp a land that is guaranteed to live for the entire rest of the game because of the rules of the format, which one is better? I don't even know how there's a debate here.
But
isn't it clearly the land that no one can touch and is +1 mana literally every turn? It doesn't matter if the farewell comes in 2 turns or 10 turns. The land is still better because it's still going to be there no matter what happens in the game.
Because
not all colors are green and white.
But it's also oversimplifying it a lot. Like, again, in Elf Ball, for example, it's like, if I play a Llanowar Elves and I Elf Ball it up, and I'm like, turn 4, I have a scary board state, drop down a Toski or something, draw a whole bunch of cards and stuff. You guys can like hope to get a board wipe, hopefully, but you're going to be so far behind. I might the Elf Ball decks win fast, right? That's the whole scariness of it. There's also a reason why everybody's so scared of Voja. Like, Voja is a dominating threat at casual tables. And if everybody was just like, okay, well, I'm going to have Hour of Revelation, it's fine, then I don't think anybody would be talking about Voja. But in reality, like, a turn 4 Voja or something swinging at you is ending the game a lot, right? And even if Voja gets killed one time, one swing is usually enough to either take somebody out or just refill your hand and you could redeploy afterwards.
Yes, that's true. But aren't we kind of like working around the edges a lot with that argument? Isn't it? It's like good in Changelings or good in Moonfolk. Like, sure, if I'm an Elf Ball deck and all the best 1-drops that say Elf on them happen to tap for mana, of course I'm going to play all the, like, why wouldn't I play those? Yes, duh, of course. Like, sure, there's a situation where mana dorks are going to be good, but we're talking about 2% of decks or something. We're talking about like some very small number of like very specific situations where it's like, if I'm doing this very specific thing, then yes, that deck does want mana dorks.
Isn't that
but 90% of decks do not want those things.
I think every deck you want to specify your ramp towards what your deck is doing. Like, for example, if I'm doing Enchantress, I'm doing Sanctum of Weaver, I'm doing Wild Growth, I'm doing Utopia Sprawl and stuff over traditional land ramp stuff because my Enchantresses are drawing me cards off that. My Serra's Sanctum is now tapping for additional mana. I have stuff that, like, gives all my enchantments Shroud or whatever. Or whenever I'm making one, I make a token off Archon of Sun's Grace and stuff. It's like, you could take every single deck and I can list you unique ramp stuff that I would run over a typical land
to combine both of your points, something that sounds like a fringe deck that's not, are artifact decks. Artifact decks are super popular, and there's a lot of different versions of them. And are you not going to play Mana Rocks because you have all your cards that say, like, when you play an artifact, draw a card, or when you, if we go off of your logic, we just never play artifact decks.
So Tomer's philosophy in an artifact deck, and a lot of people have this. I think Krim has this too. You're playing an artifact deck, you're going to die to Farewell, so let's just play all the rocks. Whereas I'm like, nah, right? Like, I have an artifact deck. I'm going to play as much land ramp as possible, and my artifact synergy is strong enough by itself that it'll take its way there. But like, I don't actually play the artifact lands, the indestructible ones, because I'm like, not worth, right? Like, for the additional synergy of one, like maybe in Tetsun it makes sense because you can draw that, right? But just for something like I'm playing, like, all my creatures get +1/+1 for each artifact, I'm like, that additional land, it's not worth the risk of going down the land. So I actually don't play Mana Rocks in my artifact decks. I still go out of my way to avoid them because I don't want to be all in, right? I think the difference is Tomer likes being all in, right? He likes the tempo, present the threat. If you answer it, I'm dead. If you don't answer it, I win, right? Like that's basically what he's doing, right? And I'm like, I like to play mid-range, right? I like to be in the game all the time. And I like my options open. And I don't like having one card like make me sit out for the whole game. So I like to like grind them out. I will play slower, but play grindier rather than faster and like more efficient, if that makes sense, right? Like that's different philosophy.
So you're not wrong for building your deck that way. I think that's like perfectly valid and fair if you want to do that. But the important thing that I think we should delve into a little bit here, because we've mentioned it several times, is that your artifact deck can just try to play more like land ramp, but if it's not, there aren't that many artifact green decks. there are plenty of white ones, but like outside of that, what are you doing? You have more than 0 options, right? You have like Surveyor's Scope, you have Wayfarer's Bauble. There's more than 0 options for land ramp outside of those colors. But what if you're like a literal Grixis deck? Maybe you only have like 5 basics in your deck or something, right? Like, what are you supposed to do?
This is interesting now, right? So you guys are saying land ramp is superior than Mana Rocks, I think, right? But certain decks and colors don't have access to land ramp, and you guys are accepting mediocrity. What I'm saying is we should be looking at the card pool and figuring out how to make this work, right? Like Dousing Dagger is a real card, right? Explorer Scope is a real card. I believe O'Hare Axonal is a real card, and I enjoy red so much this season now, and blue, once I figured out how to ramp, right? I am not hamstrung to Selesnya anymore, and we're not done. Like, people are still submitting all kinds of weird ramp tech in our YouTube comments, right? Like, we need to think hard to make this crappy ramp into good ramp. Like, remember when white catch-up ramp actually sucked? Because, like, we hadn't cracked the code, and we're like, white is terrible. Remember we poo-pooed Cartographer's Hawk? Now that you know how to use it, you're like, it's amazing, right? And white is one of the strongest colors now, right? So what we need to do is not accept getting blown out with Arcane Signet, but like figure out, of the cards that Wizards gave us in Grixis, how do we build a ramp package that's not like woefully like behind everything? And I think we're kind of there. Like, I am actually not that afraid to play Grixis into a green meta or a white meta. Like, I'm a step behind you, but just in the same way that like black is a step behind white in removal, right? But it's not like I'm so far removed that I need to go all in on like Arcane Signet and get blown out, right? Like, I feel the land ramp exists, and we just need to think about it more and work on it more. But it's like kind of there, right? And 1 or 2 more cards from Wizards, and it'll be fixed like white, right? Like that's my philosophy, rather than accepting that, well, we gotta play these Mana Rocks and then get blown out, and that's just that's how Grixis goes, right? Like, I don't like that.
I have a couple points here. First of all, on the white catch-up ramp, I think it was like 2017 or something, I made a video on Lotus Veil. I've been on Team Catch-up ramp for a long time. I think you and me, Richard, we always agree on a lot of like basic things, like white catch-up ramp, how good MTFTs
you taught me how to ramp white token. I remember the guy that pings himself. What's his face?
You know, we're also mono red buddies on like the dowsing device and stuff. But I feel like I'm like always a moderate stance. Like my idea with ramp is like, it's not like I'm all in with Mana Rocks. It's all in with this. It's like I try to take the best out of every single category, fix it with synergy, and then that's my leftover thing. It's not like, all my ramp engines have to be Mana Rocks. It's like, no, I'll run a couple to fill in the gaps, and then I'm fine. And I'll run the synergy pieces as they're there. Like Morgan said, like you don't have access to all the goodies all the time if you're not in green, for example. But like I'll mix and match.
Should matter.
And also, like, again, if it's a synergy piece, I'm gonna run it because I think it'll be worth it. But like, I think, Richard, you aim for long game resiliency. You're expecting a very heavy board wipe heavy meta, and you also want to go for a long game. Interaction heavy.
I mean, that is our
interaction
meta, though.
Heavy meta, but minus spot removal, because that doesn't.
Well, I don't need it, but I expect other people to play spot removal, right? Like, I expect things to be dealt with, and I will deal with them if not, right? But like, I don't expect everyone to just sit there and solitaire and like win whoever solitaired faster wins, right? Like, I don't believe that's how Commander works. But yeah, I go for the long game.
But I think a lot of the things that you're saying, like I do not. So I agree on some of the things where it's like, okay, yes, if you're in a self-mill deck, I love the Everflowing Well, for example. If you're in a lot of different red decks that happen to have lots of artifacts around, Dowsing Device, heck yes, I'm all the way with you. I've always been. But then, like, when you're saying like there and back again and stuff, this 5-drop Saga that after like 2 turns is going to ramp you 1 mountain or something, and then 3 turns is going to make a token. No,
that's the same thing as the Mana Rocks to me when it comes to like worrying about a game blown up. It's like, okay, yes, theoretically that's like a more explosive version of ramp. That's really cool. But if you're not like proliferating or something, getting through your chapters faster, that's like a worse investment than a Mana Rock, in my opinion, just because like you're spending 5 mana on this thing that might not ramp you instead of this 2 mana thing that will ramp you.
Seth, help me.
But it's like also like it's like if you're filled with all these like very ultra late game ramp options, what are you doing for the early game? Like early game, I'm ramping, then I'm dropping down my card draw engine and my further ramp engines, and like then maybe I'll draw into my protection spells and stuff if there is a board wipe happening. If you have like a handful of like, I have like a Brass's Tunnel Grinder I play it on turn 3 and it's gonna take me 3 turns to flip it. And then I've got my there and back again that I can play on turn 4, ideally, hopefully, maybe turn 5. And then it's gonna take me like 3 additional turns before I see any mana out of it. Like, you're just not doing anything early game, and then you're gonna be falling behind. Hopefully you have a board wipe. Hopefully. But I'm, meanwhile, ramping and drawing cards. I'm going to find my board wipes faster than you do. Probably I'll find my protection faster than you do, too. So I think that's where it comes like, I think there needs to be a balance. I feel like you're always an extreme. You always have to be like an extreme, like, I have to lane ramp at any cost, so I'm going to run like the worst options here because it checks the box. But you could just run the best out of each category is what I'm saying. Run the best.
Then what do you have to say about
but why would you
ramp? A mixture.
Yeah, I don't really see the upside of diversifying the ramp. I think why wouldn't you want to just play the resilient ramp all the time if you're given the option? Like, what's the upside to being like, oh, I'll have a few cards that get destroyed by Farewell in Hour of Revelation? Like, if I can have 0 cards, wouldn't 0 be better than some when it comes to losing my board state? And I think one thing you didn't touch on is Wizards keeps making more and more ways for other colors to ramp. I know in Red, like, you get rituals, you get treasure production. I play cards like Ragavan that are like filling that role in a way that I think is still better than having a mana rock that's just going to sit out there. In Black, you get a lot of doublers, right? You get a lot of ways where my swamps stab for twice as much mana. I focus really heavily on finding Urborg and play a lot of ways to tutor up non-basic lands, because if I can get Urborg and Cabal Coffers, I don't really need any more ramp. Like, that is going to be all of my ramp there is my package of playing like expedition maps and so forth to try to find that, because if I find that, that's going to take care of all the problems. So I feel like there's ways to do it in pretty much every color where you really don't need the mana rocks, and it's heading even more that direction. Like, I feel like my mana rock play was 100% 10 years ago, and now it's at like 25%. And if you give it 3 more years of Wizards printing cards, it's probably going to be objectively true to almost never play a mana rock. Like, yes, you can always have the exception of like, it's an artifact deck, or I'm an elf deck, so I want some mana dorks. But I feel like in a generic deck that doesn't have any of those theme pressures or restrictions, I think the correct number is going to be literally 0, where Richard is, in a short amount of time with what Wizards has been printing lately.
I think so. I have a question for you guys. So there's a common saying, right? So when we, I think this is a tempo question, right? So when we say ramp, right, you guys are usually building towards a number in your mind, and usually that number is your commander, right? Like, so if you are, a 4-drop commander, right? Ideally, you can ramp and then hit your commander like a turn or 2 turns earlier. I don't understand. I mean, I understand why people do that, but like, that's not the goal for me, right? So my question is, when you run like a 1 to 3 mana commander, do you run ramp? Like, let's say Ragavan is your commander or something. Do you run ramp? I will always run ramp because I am not tempoing someone, right? All I'm doing is building resources for when the real game of Magic starts. And to me, that's like turn 6, 7, 8, right? Like when people are trying to win or like the board wipes go off or whatever, and I'm just building as many resources as possible, and I'm not deploying threats before then, right? Because like, what is my 2 mana threat really going to do? It's not going to win the game. It's just going to get caught up in the board wipe or something. So I'm just trying to ramp and draw cards and build up as much mana and cards as possible for turn 6, 7, 8 when like stuff gets real, right? Like, I don't want to be doing, that stuff during that time, right? So do you guys run ramp in low mana value commanders? Or no, you're like, my commander's 2, like, what's ramp for?
Yeah, so the 2 mana ramp is where you really see, like, I'm getting my 4 mana commander out on turn 3, which is really important. That's an important number because a lot of the, like, busted commanders that Wizards keep printing are, like, in the 4 mana range. But if you have, like, a 2 mana commander, now you can start looking at, like, the 3+ mana ramp again, because now it's like, okay, I got my commander out. Now I need something that can scale later into the game. So I actually, once you get like, you have your 1, your 2 mana commanders, then I start looking at ramp spells that cost even more mana, because they will help you scale farther while you also already got your value out of your commander. If that makes sense. I don't know if I articulated that correctly, but
yeah, I hear what you're saying. I think you guys value your commander way more than I do.
Well, it depends on the commander. It depends on the commander. Some it's like, why would you run it out that fast?
I think in general, like running out your commander quickly is actually a bad thing. I think it's one of the things where the default mode is you should not do that. And then if you have a specific commander that wants you to do that, that's the exception to the rule. But I would say in general, I would not build to try to get my commander down the first turn possible, because I think I'm just setting myself up for those games where like it dies and then it dies again. And then when I really need it to do my thing, it's too much mana and I can't do my thing. So I actually kind of view it the opposite, I think.
So I think our metas are very different, because I think on Clash, we're always doing weird themes and everything. But when I'm sitting down at like my LGS or I have my regular play group, I notice that a lot of times my deck is just too slow. You know, like I'll have a board wipe, maybe, or like it won't be as board wipe heavy as our meta, first of all, and I don't even think our meta is that board wipe heavy. But second of all, everybody has scary engines going on, and the best way to keep up with that is to just deploy a little bit faster. I think you could go the Richard route for your deck, where you're trying to go for the late game, you're trying to have a lot of board wipes, you're trying to basically reset the board, try and catch everybody with a lot of permanents on the battlefield, wipe the board, and then like deploy after that, or board wiped again, I guess, and go for late game ramp. But like sometimes you're just gonna lose before that, and I think it can't be downplayed. Like we were talking about mana rocks and like 4-drop commanders. One of the most popular commanders out there, Kalia of the Vast. It's ranked 9. You could build to Kalia, to slow roll her, you know? You could go for a late game Kalia deck if you really wanted to. But the traditional way that is very scary and usually wins the game a lot is you do you run all the 2-drop mana rocks, you get down Kalia on turn 3. Turn 4, you swing in, you drop down like Avacyn, you know? Now my board's indestructible. Or you drop down it's something even worse, like Master of Cruelties, and you're just dead. And at that point, like, okay, on turn 5 or so, we're going to start seeing a board wipe. But at that point, Kalia can already just have all that mana available, ready for like protection or whatever it needs. Or the Avacyn's already on the battlefield, and now you need a farewell. So it's like, I don't know. I feel like if you're going for the ultra late game, I feel like that's very meta dependent. Sometimes if you do that against like a Kalia deck or whatever, or an Elf Ball deck, or like a Voja deck, you might just be too slow. It might not work out for you.
But it sounds good in theory.
Aren't those just
but
like
that's
combo
what happens
decks
at MagicCon, right?
Okay, well, but
like what happens is everyone starts focusing the Kalia player, or the Kalia player starts fighting with the other person that's like going just as fast, and then you're sitting here with like 2 Spirited Companions, and you untap and you Wrath, and it's cool, and you win. You know what I mean? Like you guys get around it because you guys start punching me because you know what's happening, right? But in a naked meta, like just a random meta, the problem is when you're trying to tempo out the table, everyone is fighting with you. So it's not like as smooth, like just because you accelerated to Kalia and then the Volja player over there is accelerating to Volja, then they're going to start trying to kill each other. You get bot time. And then this is where the fog meta comes in. You just fog, right? like they try to kill you. You fog, you untap, you farewell, and you win, right? Like there's just so many, and sometimes you die, right? Like this is not like foolproof. Obviously, sometimes you see nothing and you just get smacked in the face and you die. But you're not like drilling, like you're just 1 turn slower, right? Like when you play your bad ramp, you're 1 turn slower, but 1 turn 5 or 6 happens and the board wipe goes off. You are multiple turns ahead now. Like that's the difference, right? You just need to be a step behind everyone. You can't be like 5 steps behind everyone. You know what I mean? It's like you're not playing there and back again at CDH table, right? Like, yeah, you're dead, right? Like, you know, but I don't know. That's I think it all comes down to tempo, right? Like you guys are big on the tempo, whereas Seth and I don't believe in tempo. So this is all tempo loss, right?
I just want, draw cards, set up my mana, win.
The deck that I win the most with, that I don't play anymore because it's no longer acceptable at tables, is Edric. It's not a CDH deck because like I've tried to make it CDH, so it's not gonna do the thing. But it's just a very simple deck where I draw cards based on hitting you. So my first turn, like on the note of ramp, I actually have almost 0 ramp cards in the deck. I don't even run Llanowar Elves or anything in that deck whatsoever. I have only a couple that are like mass ramp, but it's like turn 5 or 6 that I'm even going to cast it. But it's almost 0 ramp option in that. All I want to do with Edric, turn 1, a 1/1 flyer. Turn 2, another 1/1 flyer, or maybe even 2 1/1 flyers if I'm really, really feisty. And then turn 3, I drop down Edric, immediately swing, draw 3 cards, and all my interaction is like the pitch spells, like Misdirection, and like the Force of Denial and stuff like that. All the free spells, even the janky ones. I even got Snag, where I have to discard a Forest to Fog. And then that's all I do.
That's a very
it's like
specific deck. That's very strong. Like Birds is the same way, right? People see my Birds deck. I have 0 ramp. I don't play Open the Way. I don't play Farewell. I play actual tempo because that's what Derevi does. But like, that's one out of like 10,000 right? command. Like it's very specific, right? Like obviously you don't be like, well, I'm just gonna land ramp and no, right? But in a general power level 7 or something, like your commander's not so strong that you can curve 1-drop commander and win the game, right? Like, but you can in Edric because you can just start chaining extra spells, all right? And then you have all the free counter spells, right? But that's like the exception rather than the rule, like the normal, right?
I just want to illustrate because like the late game strategy is a valid strategy, but there's also a lot of commanders that want to play the tempo game. And I think it's an equally valid strategy and you have to play towards whatever that's going. So like Yuriko's the top 3 commander. If you're playing a late game Yuriko, I think you're doing it very wrong. You want to just, start smacking people immediately with her. Krenko too. I think if you're a late game Krenko deck, there's no hope for you. There's no hope. I would love to see it, but like I feel like in mono red you don't have the late game tools to go late game Krenko. Kalia the Vast is
because you don't build it so like that.
but okay. At the same time, like Atraxa, the Erddragon, Sauron, Kenrith, Edgar, Miram, Ishin, Gishat, like many commanders in the top 10 are not like that. Like you can pick out the 2 or 3 that are, but if you go through the top 50 commanders, that's like 10% of commanders and 90% art or something. Like we're still kind of sure, do what your deck wants to do. And there are some commanders that you want to play aggressively. I don't know what that has to do with mana rocks though. That some commanders are aggressive.
Okay, so
you want to accelerate into them and win the game.
Yeah,
right? And the fastest way is mana rocks, right?
Yeah, I'm just saying that both strategies are equally valid, and you could see they're equally popular. So just because you and Richard are very team late game focused doesn't mean that like there's tempo options and like you're trying to make tempo commanders. You're trying to build them late game, and you're like, how would I run this tempo deck with like mana dorks and stuff? It's awful. It's well, that's how those decks work, right? Like it's just a different playstyle.
Arabella, Kellen, they're like 1-drop commanders. And if you, it's funny at MagicCon, I was trying to steal everyone's Arabella tech. Everyone plays a super aggro, and I just sit there and like do nothing and twiddle my thumbs until like turn 8, and it works, right? Like, but the thing is, I would argue that it works better. Like obviously you can build tempo, right? You can build anything you want. Right? But in like a random meta, most people just get absolutely blasted by an Ondu inversion. Like, imagine if Wrath of God was like a half Armageddon, but one-sided. Right? Like, you know how broken that card is? And that's what you open yourself up for a mana rock. And it's like, it's not like Ondu 6 mana. Farewell is like unattainable. Like, are you dead before you hit 6 mana against most commander decks? Like, I don't think so, right?
You might be sweating though. You might not be dead, but you'll probably be sweating. And at that point, the person who had the ramp earlier in the game probably already has gotten enough value that they don't mind their stuff getting blown up.
I don't know. Once in a while, I try these cards, and I always see like bad results. And when I see you guys play them, I'm like, that doesn't like. Maybe you win. Sometimes you just straight up win, right? But I'm like, it's so risky that I don't feel comfortable, and I don't know. I think it's okay. It's not like terrible, but I think we should be finding ways to make it better. And I believe it exists in our card pool, right? Like Surveyor Scope has existed since the dawn of time. Like I don't know how old that card is, but we just didn't look there. White Ramp existed for the longest time before it caught on as like a reasonable option. So I feel if you guys think mana rocks are a little sus, right? We should be looking at the card pool to fix it rather than just accepting that they're sus. And I still think there's a lot. I really do think O'Hare Axonal is the truth. I do think Dousing Dagger is one of the greatest cards like literally ever made. Like it should be banned.
I mean, and we've even seen Tomer doing this. Like you're playing an artifact deck the other day, and you were talking about how you were playing War of Invention to tutor out artifact lands as one of your ramp spells. Yeah. So like I know even you are on board with this to some extent, Tomer, because we've like seen it in your actual deck building. So I think there's like just like more stuff like that we can do that makes playing many mana rocks not necessary outside of the decks where it's an exception. Like that's basically where I come down on it. Like, yeah, there's going to be exceptions to everything, and you want to build your commander the best way you can for your commander. But in a generic sense, I think we're already pretty close to the point where you can find other ways of ramping where you don't need the mana rocks. And I think we're heading even more down that path, just like set by set with what Wizards is printing. So it's becoming less necessary as we get more cards.
Okay, what are the good mana rocks? 2 mana value, 3 mana value, or 4 mana value? Say I'm a mana rock believer. Do you just spam like 10 2 mana value rocks? Do you like curve it out so you go 2 into 4? Do you play the 3s for utility? What is the mana rock strategy if I want to put mana rocks into my deck?
So the 3 mana rocks is where you start getting into the really cool utility ones. So you have stuff like Cursed Mirror. I'm a big fan of Misleading Signposts. It's not a card that can
fun.
That's one of my favorites.
Celestis is awesome. So there's a lot of really just like neat extra utility. Like Celestis, I mean, you have to track day night, so gotta be with you.
That part sucks.
But it'll gain you some life. It'll give you some card advantage. If you care about filling up your graveyard, you go 4 mana. This is very deck specific, but there's like Relic of Sauron, which is perfect color fixing, and then also is letting you rummage. A lot of Grixis decks are just going to like that in general. So you go into the 3-4 mana category, you have a lot of really good option. If you're in 2 mana, I think that's where you're thinking more about your tempo, right? Like, for an example, I know this is going to fall on deaf ears because you guys don't believe that tempo is a thing, but
I'm with you.
I have
Morgan.
a mono, I have a mono green Storm deck, and the line of the deck is that if I get the perfect nut draw, I can win turn 6, maybe even turn 5. And part of that is I need as much 2 mana ramp as possible. So Tomer made a video recently where he's like, yeah, you're going to play your 3 visits and your Nature's Lore, but then like, why not also play Rampant Growth? Yeah, it's not as good, but it's 2 mana ramp. Just play it. And so that's an example of a green deck that I actually still play Arcane Signet just because I want more 2 mana ramp to help me get to my win faster. So in the 2 mana category, that's usually where you're just thinking about your tempo. There's something very specific you're trying to get out the turn earlier too. But even then, there's some utility in the 2 mana. Like there's Thought Vessel. If you're going to be drawing a ton of cards and you want to hold on to your cards, Thought Vessel's in the 2 mana slot. And then there's a couple higher mana value rocks that do a similar thing.
The Candler.
You also have Mind. Yeah, and you also have Mind Stone, which is just it taps for colorless. But if it's going to get blown up anyways, you can sack it to draw a card. So hopefully you get some mana out of it, but it's going to replace itself later on. I think Commander Sphere is almost playable still. It depends. Like if you like, Commander Sphere is kind of on the cusp of like not really playable anymore. But like worst case scenario, you get a mana out of it and you can sack it in response to draw a card if it's going to go away. So it's not completely terrible. So I think 2 mana is where you're thinking more about tempo. And 3+ mana is usually where you're going to be thinking about like extra utility.
I think
I do love the no-max hand size ones. Those are the mana rocks that I still play. If any of them are staples for me, are the ones that give no-max hand size. And I don't even care about the mana as much as I just care about the no-max hand size. But I really want the no-max hand size effect.
There's one I know.
Yeah, but I don't always draw the Reliquary Tower.
It's an extra copy of Reliquary Tower.
Yeah,
thing,
basically,
right?
yeah.
Cursed Mirror is my favorite out of the over 3 or higher. I feel like every single time I played that card, I've been impressed with it. Enter the battlefield and it copies a creature and it has haste until end of turn and it taps for red. Every single time it's just like I copy an Eternal Witness or something late game, or I just copy like some cool commander that has like a combat trigger or something, and I like smash somebody in the face and get that combat trigger. But one cool shout out that I saw Seth play. And I'm a fan of it also in monocolor decks. Throne of Eldraine. It's a 5 mana. When it enters the battlefield, you choose a color. Tap to add 4 mana of the chosen color. You can spend mana only to cast monocolored spell of that color. And then you could, if you don't need the ramp You could pay 3 and tap it to draw 2 cards, and you have to spend mana of the chosen color to do so. I think that one's actually a good one. Paying 5 mana and getting refunded 4 immediately is quite nice. And obviously, we love Coveted Jewel. I know even Richard is a Coveted Jewel believer. So there's even a mana rock that's at the 6.
What are you guys talking about?
Richard actually, the biggest mana rock believer.
Yeah.
What about Gilded Lotus? So Gilded Lotus is a 5 mana thing that taps to add 3 of any one color, I want to say. Do we play this? Because I know once in a while someone rips it out and we're like, oh, that's pretty good. All right. If they don't get blown out, it's insane.
I think it's okay in certain artifact decks. Like if there's ways that you can copy it, if there's ways you can untap it, that way you're automatically netting mana, because you have to wait till the second time you use it before you're up mana. And it's 5 mana. It doesn't do anything right away. So I haven't played that card in a couple years at this point, but I could see some decks where you still play it.
I feel like it's a boomer staple. I feel like we played a lot of that card when we first started playing Commander, that we just always have Gilded Lotus.
Yeah.
But
what about Worn Power
Stone?
Stone?
It's very necessary.
3 mana, ETB's tapped, it adds 2, or Coalition Relic kind of does the thing. 3 mana, 2. That's like an ancient 2/3. That's insanely powerful. Is that playable?
I played Coalition Relic recently, and it performed pretty well. That was in the Decades deck, so I had to make some weird choices to have ramp in that deck, especially with my colors. So I had a lot of mana rocks, kind of by default, because I just didn't have the modern like flip lands and all that stuff. But it performed really well. I still like Coalition Relic. I don't play it that often. I like it better than Worn Power Stone. I'd rather have 2 mana every other turn, I think, and 1 mana every turn, and have it be colored mana than have the 2 colorless mana every turn.
It just sounds like a lot of work where you could just play one of these 3 or 4 mana rocks that actually gives you extra utility.
But it gives you 2 mana, right? Versus utility, right?
Sure.
I mean, it's an ancient 2.
Yeah. Whichever one's more important to you in the deck, I guess.
I do think Seth is very correct. Like that, we've just been getting so many options outside of mana rocks these days that we can start replacing them. Like I remember Coalition Relic I wasn't high on for a long time. Worn Power Stone, though. I used to run Worn Power Stone a lot. And then I looked at my deck list, so I have no more copies of it. They all disappeared.
Yeah.
But it used to be a card. A Coalition Relic, I actually do run in one deck, my Venture Proliferate deck. Because you could put a charge counter on it, and then you proliferate a whole bunch of times, ideally. And then it's generating more than 2 mana on a turn cycle on average. Although it's kind of like on the cusp, because it's a little bit Christmas landy for me, even for the Proliferate deck.
Do you play the like Everflowing Chalices and stuff in that deck? Those are really good, right? Because they have like permanent,
and
permanent
Cornucopia. Those two, Everflowing Chalice and Astral Cornucopia, tap for each charge counter on it forever. So those are like 2 of the best ramp engines in the deck, because you play them early and then you just proliferate and they're starting tapping for ridiculous mana.
So bonkers. Richard, would you play those in a Proliferate deck? Because I almost think I'm more like Tomer in this sense, where like, if I'm a Proliferate deck and that's what I'm doing, I'm playing Ancient Cornucopia or Astral Cornucopia. I'm playing Everflowing Chalice. Like, yeah, they're mana rocks, yeah, they're risky, but they're so powerful with the theme of my deck that it's worth the risk in specific archetypes. So I think I'm more willing to make exceptions to the no mana rock rule than Richard is, based on the theme of the deck.
I mean, you guys make it sound like I have some like absolute decree coming from above. Like, no, right? I look at it and I think about it. And then the answer is usually no. So that's why I tell you guys it's basically no. But like, I do randomly play mana rocks. I do randomly play Swords to Plowshares, right? Sometimes it just makes sense. But in general, whenever I look like, okay, is Astral Cornucopia in a Proliferate deck worth it? I would say no, right? Because normally, if I get my Proliferate engine going, it's not like the Astral Cornucopia that's going to win me the game, right? Like once the engine is going, I win. And the easiest way to lose is to not get the engine, right? And the easiest way to get that to happen is to be cut off mana, right? So I don't like that. I wouldn't.
What will help you not get cut off mana, Richard? Something that taps for like 4 plus mana for 3.
I don't know. Like you guys, we play very heavy interaction. I believe the tempo play of accelerating out and trying to win on a temporal advantage is very difficult in a group that knows how to play Commander, right? Because everyone will have the answers ready. Everyone will have a kind of good sense as to when you're going to win, You know what I mean? Like, if I look at like a normal Atraxa deck, I can tell when you're going for the win, right? So it's very hard to do that without building the right resources up. Like when you guys are like, turn 3 commander, I'm gonna win. I'm like, what if you just drew crap cards? Like, didn't you have to like spend time like sculpting your hand, getting that T-Pro in, building the mana? Like, you got to spend time sculpting your resources, right? So I don't believe in the tempo game because you're not always going to have the nut draw. Like, obviously, you have the nut draw, you can just go for it. But usually, your hand is garbage, right? And you got to sit there and filter it.
Why'd you put garbage cards in your deck, Richard?
But like,
you gotta like accumulate the game plan in your hand and then go for it. And you need to make sure people have used their swords to plow. If you're the first creature to hit the board, the swords is coming for you, right? You need to wait for people to start using their swords to plowshare, so you actually have a chance of like getting through there. So I just don't buy this tempo strategy.
This is
right?
where we disagree. It's like, it's Christmas land to expect that you like, you know, you curve out and you drop like a Toski or a Reconnaissance mission or whatever effect to start refilling. But then it's not Christmas land to believe that by turn 5 or 6 there is a board wipe. It's happening. There's no doubt about it. And if you have
because you don't need the board wipe on 5, right? You just need chump blockers to not die on 5, and you can draw it on 7, and you can draw it on 8 or whatever, and then you won the game, right? Like. A lot needs to go because like your deck just doesn't work half the time. You know what I mean? Like a lot of times you build the perfect Atraxa deck, you draw a 2-lander and like nothing happens, right? Like you're not able to curve out and do like your deck is struggling against itself. Throw in 3 players of interaction. There's a lot that can go wrong, right? So
well, I know at least one opponent doesn't run swords. I don't know if Seth is going to be running swords. I don't even think Seth is the swords believer either.
We don't
feel like
I've heard running swords.
I've
come back around to swords a little bit.
If you want to turn fog me, I'm fine with it. I'll take it.
But that's because you're going lethal, right? Can you go for lethal on turn 4 on me?
No, but if I just want to draw 4 cards off a Toski, if you're going to fog it, I'm like, okay, heck yeah.
So this is something that I think is very meta specific as well. Like, is everything that the Commander Clash podcasts say going to apply to every single meta that exists? Probably not.
No,
so I think a lot of this comes. No, I'm serious. Hear me out, and here's why. Because in the Clash meta, it's not uncommon for people to be playing like 5+ board wipes. A lot of people are only playing like 2 or 3. And even if you are playing, like, everyone's playing some number of board wipes, and they're usually for sure hitting the, like, get rid of the creature board wipes. You go into, like, the artifact enchantment board wipes that mostly are going to come from white, they're usually more likely to customize towards the board wipes that are going to wreck their deck less. If they have any artifacts, Commander players are greedy. They will not choose artifacts on their austere commander or whatever in order to keep their artifacts. So I'm just saying that, like, Seth could strip mine Tomer's Bounce Land. I'm just saying that cards have risks tied to them. We play them anyways because we're sure we're going to get more use out of them than the mana we invested into them. That's just all I'm saying is I think it's mana rocks are more likely to stick around than you think because most of the board wipes you're going to see are creature specific.
So I would agree with that. Outside of the Clash meta, I think that, okay, so here's how I see this. I think that most people play what they open. Like when it comes to, if you look on EDH Rec, what percentage of people play Onto Inversion? 2%. Even Farewell, the one we talk about all the time, 13%. You know what that means in practice? Those sound like big numbers. But that means 98% of people with white in their deck do not play Onto Inversion. That means 87%, 9 out of 10 people playing white do not play Farewell in the broader meta. In our meta, it's very close to 100%. Like, what most people do is they're like, I need a Wrath. So whatever Wrath I opened in my precon, it's a Day of Judgment, it's a Wrath of God. What do I, like, whatever. I need a Wrath, I'll throw whatever Wrath I got in our deck. We build our decks every single week, and we optimize every single week. And it's Farewell, and it's Onto Inversion, and it's Hour of Revelation every single week. We're not sitting there and like, well, okay, I'm going to, just grab whatever Wrath I happen to have next to me and throw it in my deck, which is what most people do when they play Commander. So I think in our meta, I don't think you can do it. I think in the Clash meta, if you see me playing in a Magic Con, my decks are way more likely to have mana rocks in them than they are in Commander Clash. Because I just don't think that most people build their decks to punish mana rocks when I think that we do build our decks to punish mana rocks.
I do not believe that we run as many Farewells as we're led to believe here. But
so
we'll
the number 1, number 2
too.
white Wraths, according to EDH Rec, are Austere Command and Farewell. So that is worth mentioning.
Yeah.
So, but also, I think you're undermining what the average Commander player is. There is a percentage who is like literal kitchen table, like casual. I'm only playing with what I got. Maybe I'll buy the couple like super important cards I need, and that's it. But like, there's enough good, flexible Wraths at a reasonable price that people can just head over to cardkingdom.com/mtggoldfish and pick up the cards they need. Like, I think people put more effort into their decks than you give them credit for, on average.
But then why are 2% of people playing onto inversion when 90% of Commander Clash players are playing onto inversion?
Because they don't ramp.
Well, because our
Revelation
and onto inversion are they're hard resets, and most decks don't need hard resets. Most decks can find the board wipes that hurt them less than they hurt their opponents. There's ones that if I'm a token deck, I'll destroy all the non-token creatures and so forth.
But if you play no mana rocks, they hurt.
Let me give you
your opponent by default. Like it plays into the whole thing.
Sunscour or something. One-sided board wipes, right? I'm like, do people not play board wipes in 60-card formats because they're symmetrical? Like, no, right? You play land ramp and card draw, and then your 3-mana Hour Revelation is now a one-sided board wipe that's also like a half Armageddon attached. But so here's the thing: if no one in your meta destroys mana rocks and everyone plays mana rocks, right? I will sell you a course and I will give you like a money back guarantee of how to win, right? And it's called, you play Selesnya, you play Rampant Growths, Open the Way, Explosive Vegetations, and you play 6 white sweepers that sweep everything. Your win percentage guaranteed. I guarantee you 50 plus. It doesn't even matter what finisher you play, right? Because as soon as you hit mana, you see mana rocks on the table, you're like, these guys are cooked. Right? And you're ramping fast because you're green. You're not even playing like jank ramp, right? You're playing like legit ramp. Like the resource advantage is immense, right? Because Open the Way for 6 mana is draw 4 cards and then put 4 lands onto the battlefield, right? Like that's how many resources you're getting with that kind of ramp, right? So you just need to survive to play the onto inversion and green will make you there. And once you have realized how easy it is, you can go hard mode and try to do this without green, right? Well, then you can do the slower ramp.
But the Grixis deck is still screwed. The Grixis decks are still screwed because they could try playing Surveyor Scope, but I've been paying attention, Richard. I edit Commander Clash. We'd have like the one time where Surveyor Scope is like, whoa, it's insane. It's so good. But almost every other time, it's just like, eh.
It's actually bad in meta because everyone is playing bounce lands and Lotus Fields now, so you can't actually ramp the Surveyor Scope anymore.
So what is the Grixis deck supposed to do? That's something I brought up earlier, but like, what are they supposed to do?
It's also like you have to play mana rocks and auto lose to white. Like you got to do something else, right?
But they okay. First of all, they don't. But also, it's like insanity to be like, okay, you know how to metagame your playgroup. You play Selesnya, you run every single Wrath of God effect. It's like, okay,
that
you know how to metagame your playgroup in Dimir?
sphere.
You start with Fastest Oracle and a Tainted Pack, and you'll win all these games. It's like, okay, so?
Yeah.
Are you comparing onto inversion to Thoracle combo?
No, but if you're
is that the comparison we're making
board
here?
wipe dot deck, it's like, okay, so take the cool thing you want to do, ignore that. Just run all the green ramp cards at lane ramp, and then run all the board wipes, because you got to have the board wipe on like turn 5 or so. Otherwise, what are you doing? If you have like a single farewell, most of the time you're not even going to see it in the game, right?
14 cards of your like 60 slots dedicated to ramping and like interaction, right? Like it's like, why play Swords to Plowshares? You could play another Enchantress piece, Tomer. Like you have to have some room for interaction, and it's not that much, right? It's not like you're changing like everything, right? But
no, but like you're saying, like you'll see if you put a farewell in your deck, you'll see it in every single game. But like I know I have so many decks where like I haven't even drawn the card yet, you know, like I put it in the deck,
but no,
I haven't even seen it ever. It's like, okay,
but if you play Farewell and onto inversion and Hour of Revelation and Planar Cleansing or whatever, like if you keep going down that list, like I'm saying,
and then you're playing a board wipe deck, right? You're just playing a Selesnya board deck.
That's
but
the
how many rounds do we typically play in Commander Clash? Like 5 to 8, right? Like that's just what our meta is. Like I don't know what. Yeah, where have you been in the last 10 years? Yes!
I'll look at my own list.
How
I'm running like
know what our
board
meta's
wipes in my decks.
We've had whole conversations and podcasts.
But it's
like
not
we know Krim
true.
runs 9 Ras. Richard's runs It's math. It's just like the numbers. We have data on this, right? Like we actually have stats from last season. Farewell and Onto Inversion
Maybe
are
I'm
the
the outlier.
9th and 10th most played overall cards. Overall, out of all the cards, no creature, no spell, nothing. 9th and 10th most played behind like T-Pro, Demonic Tutor, One Ring, Mana Drain. Like they are everywhere in our meta. Like I don't know. Our experience is very different, I guess, because I expect that there's going to be like in our pod 20 Wraths at least. Between Crim playing 8 or 9, Richard playing 4 or 5.
Crim is a higher.
There's going to be like
average.
20. There's going to be like 20 Wraths in the total pod. Someone's going to hit one by turn 5. Like just mathematically. Yeah, if I have a single Farewell, the odds of me having it on turn 6 are not that high. But if there's 20 Wraths at the table, the odds of someone having it is pretty reasonable, right?
People blame Crim, but Crim doesn't play that many Wraths. He plays a lot of like counter spells and spot removal. I am the Wrath offender, and I actually cut Wraths because A, I don't play white. I've been playing like Grixis, but also B, because Seth has metagamed me, right? Like he's just ramping and card and draws. It's the same source of Plowshare's argument, right? If Seth is ramping and playing, drawing cards, and I use 8 mana onto Inversion, I'm losing the game. Right, so the 9 Wrath meta I quickly learned was not correct. Right, you're just like canning set the game when you do that. So it's like down to 4 or 5. But like Crim doesn't actually rat that much. Everyone's always like, oh, once Crim leaves, no one will police the board for Richard. I'm like, I police the board all the time, right? Like I
run 3 Wraths
offender of it, right?
Deck like I don't run like 6 or 8. Like what is this insanity? Like I'm definitely not contributing to this 20 total. I don't know how many you're running per deck, but I'm like 3.
You also believe in like thematic Wraths. So I think you're less likely to be like, Hour of Revelation, Onto Inversion, Farewell are the best Wraths. So those are in my Wrath slots every deck. Instead, you're more likely to be like, well, I'm going to play Scour Glass in this, or I have this 8 mana Convoke token thing that's cool in my token deck, so I'm going to play that. So I think you're less likely to be playing the Wraths that punish mana rocks anyway, just because of how you build your deck. So you're not always going to be playing the ones that like invalidate mana rocks.
There's also like the easiest way to be like, if you're at a play group and there's just everybody's like playing creatures and stuff or mana rocks, and there's just the one guy who's just like land ramping, and he's just board wiping and stuff. You don't have to change your deck. You just have to be like, okay, that guy is not doing anything to the board state. He's playing like a Spirited Companion or whatever. Everybody just attack him. And force the board
How many
wipe.
years have you said kill Richard first? And how many times do I actually die? It's like very difficult.
No, but if you're the blood bag, like if I have combat triggers and stuff, I gotta hit people, right? A lot of my decks are just like, I need to hit people for my Mask of Memory or something to draw cards. You're gonna be the blood bag. You're gonna take a lot of hits. And if I know you're just a board wipe deck, then I just won't deploy that much stuff. Like I feel like this is like, I don't know. It might be good in like random pods and stuff, but like even then, I don't know. I think it's like a very Commander Clash meta thing that we're all like terrified of.
But the
inevitable
meta
board wipes.
when you take like the true test when you go to MagicCon and like, does it actually work? And it works like 5x more effective, right? People do not like look at the board and be like, I'm not overextending into it. You know, people are not like, oh, look, he's not deploying anything. The Wrath is coming, you know? Like, they're just like, oh, let me just play more stuff. I need 8 more mana dorks, right? Like, they're just like hemorrhaging their cards on the battlefield, right? Like,
but
as soon as there's a threat, people will fire their spot removal off immediately, right? Like, once Smothering Tide comes down, everyone's itching to throw off their removal against it, right? I'm like, okay, cool. You guys do that, right? Like, but it's it works in the broader meta, like, very easily.
So I was tracking. I'm tracking my stats as well for wins and losses, just out of curiosity. I also have like an 80% win rate at conventions, but I'm also not like, I play drastically different than Richard. Drastically different.
I think that you different. Guys probably just play more than the average player, so you know your decks better. You are probably just like a little bit of a better player than the average player, just because you get all the reps in. Like, you know, the average player plays like, you know, maybe a couple times a month, you know, is probably the average Magic player. They play a few times a month at their LGS or with their friends. You guys are playing minimum every week for Commander Clash.
We have to do a test, Morgan. We need to use our children in this science experiment. How old does my son need to be before he walks into a pod with a random Selesnya deck that Daddy built for him and wins? You know, it's like the bottom red meme. I'm like, son, just ramp and cast Hour of Revelation. He's like, I can't read, Dad. What is going on? I'm like, don't worry, you got this.
Yeah, step one is our kids have to know how to read.
Yeah, no, they don't know how to read. They just gotta be like every green player. Rapid growth, open the way, onto inversion. That's the curve, okay, son? You can do it.
That's it.
You will win no matter what happens. Trust in the heart of the cards. Okay. I mean, I don't know what we've accomplished today. I feel I need to play white more to get Tomer off of the I feel because I've been playing so much Grixis, you guys haven't felt the true pain of
you were so sad to look at my deck list for my Tetsun and be like, where's the Feral? I'm like, you want
I mean, that makes sense, right?
Scour?
Like I can guess that before I see, because your deck is all artifacts. You're not gonna run the Farewell. You need the recursion, right? But you know,
Farewell says choose one or more, right? You don't have to choose all the modes.
Yeah, but then it just becomes an austere command.
It's not
as good, right? If you're not hitting,
I can blow up all non-artifacts.
Or if you hit your creatures get exiled, right? But yeah. So I don't know, Seth. Are you more likely to play Mana Rocks now?
I don't know if this has actually changed my mind about Mana Rocks. I think I'm more or less where I started before, where I'm going to try to avoid them when I can, but I also am okay with playing them when the situation calls for it, in small numbers. So I think that's basically where I started. I think Tomer and Morgan had some good points about like doing what's right for your deck, right? Like not every deck's going to be the same. Some decks are going to, I believe, want a Mana Dork or a Mana Rock in them, and you should think that through when you're building your deck. So I think there were definitely some good points. But in the end, I'm kind of in the same place where, given the choice, I'm going to try to avoid Mana Rocks as much as I can.
Our New Year's resolution should be play tempo. And once we accept to play tempo, all of this will make sense, right? Now you play Mana Rocks. I don't even know what that
means. What is
you need the one mana source, the plowshares. Like it's absolutely required because you're playing tempo. So I think once we shift our mind into the tempo mindset, then there is like a purpose to these cards, right? But if you're trying to play them with the grindy mindset, then it doesn't make any sense, right? So we need to play.
I think we all agree to that, right?
The easiest tempo is combo because there's no tempo really, right? You assemble the thing like Mono Green Storm and you win, so you don't have to maintain this tempo. But the trick is to play it in a non like actual like combo deck, right? Like to get tempo and maintain tempo and win. And the only way I can think of is like the cheese decks, like Infinite Turns, like Narset, like Kali, like you're like, yeah, once I get the attack off, I win and I can keep going.
Okay, so
but I gotta figure out how to do this in the same way.
I don't know.
Yeah, that's why we banned it.
It was funny. I looked at my decks and I was like, yeah, I have so many Mana Rocks, and no, it was only Selenia, Zedru, Melik, Tetsun prefers Venser.
Tomer is so
some
close.
of them are just two.
Tomer is so close to joining the darks. He thinks they're not good, but he thinks they're a necessary evil. So once we show him that it's not a necessary evil, he'll switch. Morgan, we need to work
farewell him a couple more times.
Morgan, we ride the Astral Cornucopia out of my cold dead hands and Venser. I'm sorry.
It would be interesting if I guessed it on a season of Clash and I just lost literally every game. Because
you will very quickly take out your Mana Rocks.
Because the only deck that I don't have Mana Rocks in is my new aggro deck, but it still has Soul Ring. But like it doesn't have any other Mana Rocks. But like all of my other decks have some number of Mana Rocks, even if it's just like 2 or 3. Like all my bless you, dog. But all my other decks have them. So it hasn't led me astray. Like
you can go back to the season where we started
Vandal
doing
Blast
it.
or the Farewell.
You will see it, right? Like bounce lands. Remember we used to get laughs for playing bounce lands, and now we're like, it's the greatest thing ever made, right? Like first you try, you're like, it's a little sus, maybe you get blown out, and then you're like, actually it works, and it works more often than not, and then it becomes meta. I feel Mana Rocks, we've had 17 years to experiment with, right? Or 17 seasons. That's actually half the time. So 8 years or whatever, right? So I don't know.
One question before we end things. For Mana Rocks, you'll still run Richard and Seth. You'll still run Soul Ring, yes? Assuming it's not banned. You not even Soul Ring?
Yeah. Oh.
Tempo loss.
Oh, I would.
Seth,
yeah.
yes.
Same with like Mana Crypt, which before that was banned, or like the super busted ones. If I'm going high power, I think they're so explosive on turn 1 that
I mean, if you're going high power, it's different. If I'm playing a Storm combo deck,
casual.
No.
If we're playing casual,
I've seen Phil go Soul Ring into Arcane Signet, into Commander, into Hour Revelation, out of the game like multiple times. Like it's not just like once, right? Like it's the tempo game plan. I don't believe in it. So once I'm a tempo believer, I will play Sol Ring, right? But I'm not a tempo believer.
I don't play Sol Ring. I house banned it off myself, so I don't run it, but I would.
I have it in all my Magic Con decks. Like the decks I don't play in Clash that I just bring to Magic Cons, I play Sol Ring.
Yeah, it's in none of my decks, but if I didn't have a self restriction, I'd run it. But that's probably the hottest of all the takes, and I think that's best spot to end it. The comment section.
That'll be the comment.
What do you think?
Sure. For the people who made it all the way through.
Do you think?
Just remember, Richard's a liar because he always plays Coveted Jewel, and that's a mana rock.
Well, that's true.
I play mana rocks than all of you because I play Coveted Jewel in every single deck. Like literally.
The ramp has to get online by turns 5 or later, or else it's unplayable. That's the Richard strategy. All right. That's it for our intervention. Nothing has changed in terms of our opinions, but maybe your opinions have changed. Leave a comment down below what you think about mana rocks, which ones are worth it and why, and which ones maybe you're starting to take out the mana rocks after this debate. Let us know in the comment section, and we'll be back next week with another podcast. Until then, friends, see ya.